Hi everyone, it's Linda, and this is all about stitching out that banner that we did, wall hanging, whatever you want to call it. It's not terribly huge, but it fits on my door perfect. Um, so it's to create the sunflower one that you created in the software if you followed the software instructions. These were the ones that I did earlier. This is the snowman, and then I did the pumpkin was my first one. And when you do these things, you tend to do a whole bunch of different things. And experimenting. So let's go through the supplies real quick. You're going to need a variety of threads. Sewing thread I like to use to sew everything together. And then variety of threads to match my fabrics. This is for my leaves. So it's just a matter of coming up with the threads you need. I'm using a 90 embroidery um, titanium needle. I'm going to use some Steamosine. Get that out of the way. I have three different colors for my sunflower. This is for the center and this is for the two sets of petals. So believe me, I went through my stash. It took me forever to figure out what I was going to do, so that's what I decided on. I like using applique scissors. These are the two Inspira applique scissors that you can get. Depends on how tight you want to get with your cutting out, but those are the ones I use back and forth. I have a set of pinking shears because I like to use my pinking shears when I'm trimming things up. I also have a pinking rotary cutter, which I really like. And now for the real stuff that you got to have. 360 by 260 hoop. Now, if you're going to use a smaller hoop, you would use a smaller hoop and go forward with that. I use the Whisper Web mesh, and it's the wide one. It's the one that is let's see if it tells me real quick. Oops. It's 20 inches by 10 yards, but I like this because it covers my entire hoop and it works perfect. I sometimes use scraps, so it doesn't really matter with this particular project. You can use scraps. There's my 360 by 260 hoop. Top fabric, 12 by 15, and basically I use a third of a yard of fabric to do the whole thing. So there's my top piece of fabric. I have two other pieces of fabric. This is for my back, and this is the secret for doing this so that you can turn it all around at one time. And my back pieces are a 4 by 12 that I've taken and I folded under so I have a nice clean seam here, or a nice clean area. And then my other piece is 13 by 12. Then I have the two that I'm going to use for my hanger, and they're about 4 by 10. And so what I'm going to do on the sewing machine before I even get started is I'll actually sew these together, and I'll sew here and here because my raw edge is going to be covered up when I get sewing. Then I need a piece of batting in order to cover the whole thing, and I like to use it, make it big enough so it covers inside the hoop. And then you need a dowel rod for hanging or whatever you're going to use for hanging. So that's basically what you need. I'll actually put an actual supply list on the Linda Stitchins group page so you have an actual written list of supplies that you need. Okay, so I'm ready to hoop. What I did is I took those two pieces that were 10 by 4 and I sewed them together on the edges, and then so if I turn this back out, I just sewed them together, short ends together, flipped it around, sewed this together. So when I get ready to use this, I'm actually going to lay this up here and it will give me my spot to put my dowel in. So I have that ready, and that's the only piece I really did on my sewing machine. So I have my stabilizer, I have my batting, and I have my fabric with right side up. And I'm just going to lay that in here. And hoop everything together. Okay, so I have this all ready. I've got my design up on my screen on my machine, and when you were hooping this, you probably noticed that the fabric isn't all the way out to the outside edge. If you want to cut your fabric just a little bit larger, that's fine. But the first step, remember when we were doing this, we created this the shield so that it was going to hold everything together. Now you could also use a basting stitch and your fixed stitch on your machine and do that too. But we're just going to sew the first one. So hang on. Just a word of caution, when you're using that 360 by 260 hoop, it is very large. So you want to make sure this first stitch is actually going to be way down here at the bottom. So you want to make sure that you have plenty of room at the back of your machine because it is very large and it can very easily get bumped. You want to make sure when it comes forward, it's not going to hit anything either. My camera stand's going to be in the way, so I'm going to kind of move it back and forth. So you'll kind of probably notice that here in the videos. And so the first thing it's going to do is it's going to sew down that stitch, and I just use regular sewing thread. I do have bobbin thread in my bobbin, and I'm just using white. Now you could use black. I use the pre-wounds from the Viking Galleries. They work great, and so I'm just going to sew out this first one. So hang on. Just another hint, when you're sewing this out, because I don't have the fabric large enough so that it's actually caught, I'm actually kind of smoothing it out at the same time just to make sure. Now, if I was really good, I would have probably cut this a little bit bigger, but I tend to be a little bit more conservative on this stuff. So I just kind of, because it's just a basting stitch and it's just kind of going around fairly quickly, and I can kind of use my hand to smooth everything. So the next color change is going to be for those motifs that we did, and it's going to cover the whole thing. It's going to flatten it. Now it's going to cover all the way down into here, but that's okay because we're going to cut all this away. It's just going to cover the whole thing, makes it nice and smooth. So whatever color you're going to use, I just use regular sewing thread. I sometimes have been known to use my bobbin thread because bobbin thread is only 60 weight, so it doesn't give it quite, it's not quite as stiff looking, but I'm just going to use regular sewing thread for this one. Okay, so I have all of my first color sewn out. Actually, it's my second color. And so all of the quilting is now done all the way around. And this area is not quilted. That's because, remember, we took that, and when we went into the Quilt Block Wizard, we added our quilt block in the center. So it would actually only quilt up to those edges. So now what we're going to do is we're going to do the first part of our appliques of the sunflower. So you're going to lay your largest piece of fabric. This is the one that's going to go all the way to the back, and then you're going to lay your next one, and then you're going to lay your next one. So I'll do the first one and I'll show you. Okay, so I have my first fabric laid down, and it's completely tacked down. I'm getting ready to do the satin stitch, and it's only going to do the satin stitch around the edges, the points that aren't going to be covered up. But I wanted you to notice that those stitches, these here, are up underneath there, so they're not going to be right there at the edge. I kind of like that because it's out of my way, but you notice it kind of gives me a little puffiness inside here. So I'm going to go ahead and continue sewing. Okay, so here's the second applique, and I know somebody's going to tell me that I have my hoop, my inside of my hoop in backwards. It's working. I'm not going to touch it. But the other thing I forgot to tell you about is using your hoop clips, because that will help hold everything nice and taut and together. So make sure you do that, and make sure, I just couldn't see when I was putting it all together because the lights are down so I can do the videos, and I didn't see that I had actually put my hoop in backwards. If you notice, this should be up at the top, but that's okay. It's working, and that's all that matters. So see, we all make mistakes. So anyway, this is the second piece of the applique, and I've got that done, and it's going to go back and it's going to do the satin stitch, and then it's going to do the centerpiece. Okay, so now I'm ready to do my little smiley face in the center. You notice this is kind of puffy. It's because we have all those layers of fabric with the batting and everything, and there's nothing really holding all that down. The other thing I want you to note, when you're doing the trimming around this particular one, you want to get really, really close, because if you notice, I didn't get close enough, and this satin stitch is not as big as the satin stitch that's here. So just pay attention to that. I kind of like the fray kind of raw edge kind of stuff, so I'm going to leave it as it is, and I'm going to do the smiley face now. So I'm getting ready to do my letters, and one of the things I like to do when I do letters is I actually shut off my jump stitch trim commands. So I go into my settings on my sewing machine and actually choose where it says thread count options. I turn it off. The other thing you can do is if you hit the stop button, what's going to happen on the Vikings is it's going to continue to sew, and I don't want it to do that. I just want it to not cut between every one of the letters, because I need it to stop before I get to that very end. When you do that, when you hold that stop button, it pretends it's all monochrome, so I didn't want to do that. So I'm going to do the letters, and then just before I do that last step, I'm going to come back. Okay, so here's my design all stitched out. Now what I'll do is I'll cut these off later, but the last thing we're going to do is that very last stitch that's going to sew everything together. And there's a secret to the way you do this so that you don't have to do a whole lot of hand sewing, so hang on. Okay, so I have that piece that's going to be for the dowel rod, and what I want to do with it is I'm going to take this and I'm going to lay that so this raw edge is up past that first line of stitches that's up here. I want to make sure that it's up this way. So what's going to happen is it's going to get sewn in place at the same time, and you want to center it left to right. So I'm going to set it right about here. Then the next thing you want to do, can you see where that's centered? The next thing you want to do is you're going to take that one piece of fabric that you have, that one that we folded down this little edge here like this, and you're going to take that and you're going to make sure it's up high enough so it's going to get covered into the seams, and you're going to lay this so that this part is down. So right sides together, right side, so wrong side is showing up. So if you want to take some tape and kind of hold that in place, you can do that, but I think it'll hold together pretty good. So now I want to take again my last piece of fabric, and that's that other piece, and I'm going to again lay it right sides together. So I'm going to lay this and I'm going to overlap that folded area and then down here. Now I need to make sure that it's coming down here and covering all the way to the edge. So I need to come down here and I need to make sure that, and it's kind of hard to see right here, but there's my last stitch. And I need to make sure that this is down here and that this may have to come down just a little bit. And so now I should have, this should be right here. Make sure that this is down here. And if you want to double check yourself, make sure that all your pieces are going to get included into that seam. So if you need to move this down just a little bit, you can do that. Again, you can tape this into place if you want to, and again lay that. So you kind of play with this until it's about where it needs to be. And remember, when you're cutting this fabric out, you can always be a little bit more generous. So I need to make sure that nothing moves. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the sewing thread and I'm going to sew that last stitch. So up here where this went over, you need to make sure that everything is like this, so that you have that folded edge down here and then this is laying on top, because we're going to seal that off when we finish turning it. So make sure that you do this. Now it's going to sew up and across over here, and it's going to sew everything in place. Now when it comes to this side, if you want to put some tape down to hold it in place, you can do that. I'm not going to, but you could tape that down so you make sure that when that foot comes down here, it doesn't grab this and pull this down this way. Okay, so I now have it all sewn together, and so I'm going to get rid of my hoop clips, and I'm going to turn my hoop upside down to do that, so it doesn't make a mess and I don't get popped and they don't go on the floor. Set them all aside, and there's my hoop clips. Now what I need to do is I'm actually going to cut all the way around the outside, about 1/4 of an inch. Now what I do like to do is to use my rotary cutter that's got the little pinking shears on it. You can do that, or you can use regular pinking shears. And the reason I like to do that is as you're using pinking shears and you're coming around these circles here, what happens is it gives it that capability. Remember when you did sewing lessons, you actually had little clips, so it will lay flatter. So I'm going to get that done and I'll be right back. Okay, so now that you've got everything trimmed away, and I've trimmed all this, and I've used my scissors, and I've trimmed my little corners, so I have everything like this. So now what you want to do is you're going to actually take this and you're going to turn it inside out. Or right side out, I guess it would be. Get that all turned. And what I would do is take this over to the iron, and actually once I get this all in here and poked around and run my fingers along there to make them nice and edge, I would take and press that all nice and neat, nice and clean. So then the last thing you want to do is when you're all done is take this here, and I'm going to take some Steam-A-Seam, and I just need to take that Steam-A-Seam and press that into place along here, and then tear off that paper and put it all in place. Or you could hand sew that, but I tend to just use the Steam-A-Seam. It works just fine. And I hope to see some samples of what you put together. It's a pretty easy process. It's just time consuming as far as taking the time to sew it out, because it is a very large one. But I think he came out kind of cute. I'll take and trim these up later. Thanks.